Well, thank you for joining the CPA Innovation Summit. We're the team over here at Mindbridge, and we're about to disrupt yourselves. We're about to talk about AI and how you can get ahead of the standards. And I'm really, really excited today because some of you have seen me before at these events. I wish we could be there in person, but today is going to be all about being disruptive and being transformative. I'm JC. I'm going to be the host for today, and with me, I'm really excited. I have Stuart Cobb, and Stuart's been working with Mindbridge for the last year and a half, almost 2 years in a full-time capacity, but he's really an auditor at heart, a startup CEO, and a technology thought leader. And he spends all of his time working with me and other clients around the world to really help them understand how technology can fit into a variety of cycles. And those cycles could be anything from, financial statement reporting type environments through to using advanced data analytics in a variety of capacities, whether it's in risk advisory services, whether it's at the enterprise. And really, at the end of the day, it's because he brings this really strange skill set of not only being a chartered accountant, also being an accomplished data scientist, but really just a person that thinks about technology as being a gateway to get out of the ruts that we're in. And I'm going to pull from a bunch of slides that Stuart's done before. So some of these he's seen, some of these he hasn't seen, and it's going to be a really exciting conversation over the next 50 minutes. So welcome, Stuart. This is the very first slide I'm going to throw at you just to say, you talk about complexity, you talk about artificial intelligence quite a lot. What are you thinking?
So I think when we're talking about artificial intelligence, there seems to be a couple of preconceptions that many people have. And I think for our industry in particular, it's important that to understand that many of the applications really fall into this category of applications that I would call data science. So these are methods and toolings that are leveraging machine learning techniques to help people understand and deconstruct really complex relationships that exist within data. And I think where we're dealing with a lot of these kind of high-level judgmental issues like we are in audit, I think having a strong understanding of where exactly these algorithms fit and what value they provide is crucial in order to build a robust value delivery framework that relies on artificial intelligence.
So I really like that, and I think it kind of talks to the slides and the charts that we've been reviewing together for quite some time. Obviously, this is from, March 2020's study from the FRC, the Financial Reporting Council, and when we look at this, I think you and I both would probably agree that there's just more to be done, and this could be in industry practice as a public accountant, doing a variety of types of engagements for their clients, but this equally is applicable to the enterprises that they service themselves. And what's interesting is, we're all sort of used to technology, right? We think about our smartphones today as just being the thing we need. I think I'm a little bit more gray-haired than you, Stuart, but I remember the very first BlackBerry I held, and I thought to myself, this is going to be really, really interesting to see how this progresses. We went from, not even having cell phones to then having, mobile phones that were like bricks, and then we ended up with, pager systems, which then would, text you that someone, sent, wanted you to phone them back, and you'd go to a payphone, or you'd go to a phone, or sometimes you'd have those bricks carrying cell phones. And then all of a sudden we transitioned to the BlackBerry, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, like this is insane. I'm getting not just, one line words, call me back at, but I'm now getting full on access to corporate information systems, predominantly email initially. And then now look at where we are, right? We talk about technology, and we look at how enterprises are using them. Very interesting. And you can see what's probably a downside to where we are is that a lot of this is still research and pilot, right? Outside of the ubiquitous using smartphone applications to connect with your clients or connect with your team, like using Power BI on the go or something like that. But when you look at this chart, do you see anything else that's kind of telling about, other than the fact that most of the stuff is in research and in pilot usage, and what you'd want to comment on?
Well, I think the FRC went out and they surveyed 6 of the largest firms in the UK. So just to provide watchers with a bit of context for what this chart represents, I think when you're looking specifically at accountancy and audit use cases, it tends to be the large professional services firms that are somewhat leading the enterprise, but then in other use cases, you often see enterprises leading the large professional services firms. and kind of innovating on new use cases. I think when I look at that machine learning line, with one firm having deployed machine learning in a large scale way in its audit methodology and everybody else in research and pilot, to me that speaks to two of the largest challenges that any machine learning algorithm or any data science team more broadly might have when implementing these techniques. And that is, firstly, that 90% of the work is in data engineering rather than on algorithm building. And the second is on the difficulty of creating people that sufficiently straddle the domain expertise and the data science required to see value from these kinds of technologies. Now, of course, as Mindbridge, we're doing everything we can to lower both of those barriers. You know, on the building the bridges between data science and audit, we're trying to present the information in as digestible a fashion as possible, and doing our best through our great customer success team to lead people to a point where they understand where they can use these kinds of technologies. But certainly on the data engineering side, there's, I would say, probably a classic long tail data problem in the audit space, where there's a huge variety of different potential data sources that all have their own data models that the industry as a whole is only coming to grips with now. And I think as people realize the value of leveraging machine learning, all of a sudden there's a reason to start connecting the dots between all of these different data models. So
Yeah, and it's
yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting you mentioned that, because the other piece of this is obviously that predictive is deployed 3 out of 6 firms. Research is being conducted at 2 of the others, and the other one declined to comment on where they are. But I mean, it's a little bit like a hierarchy of analytics too, isn't it? In that, you know, we've for so long been looking at basic trending graphs, you know, based on, say, trial balance, and now you're talking about data engineering, because to really make these things sing, you sort of need to start appreciating there's more data to come, right? I think is part of where you're going. You know, would that be kind of accurate and fair?
Yeah, absolutely. And with each new data source, the data literacy and data skills of the firms, the requirements for those skills only grows.
Yeah. And so, you know, when we talk about knowing that part of our audience is in industry, you know, working in businesses, you know, helping them grow, helping them maintain, what I thought would be interesting is also contrast not just the, you know, the big firm kind of concept, or the, you know, the accountancy firm side, but also looking at this from AI's impact just on general business. And I found this chart really compelling, because when you look at what it's saying, this was from a global survey that McKinsey and Company did last year, around this time, actually, when you're probably watching this. And what they're basically saying is, as I would have expected, because I've been in tech for about 20 years, marketing and sales are at the leading front of usage, right? In terms of using AI to try to find, you know, either cost decreases or revenue increases, right? You know, looking at how to accelerate the sales cycle, how to accelerate the client conversation. And what's interesting is I scroll down the list and I look at strategy and corporate finance, and I look at risk and sort of that type of operation, which is really a great place where AI could start to be more harnessed, I think, because what you see here from my lens is, you know, you've got this ability to really start accelerating the overall adoption inside your business, and that can be everything from using robotics process automation. I mean, we know of clients in your neck of the woods that have spent a significant amount of time implementing RPA to deal with either you know, accounts payable load on individuals, right? Automatically filing the payables as they come in, start booking the entries. You've got other great technology companies that are friends of the MACPA, like ourselves, like BotKeeper and a few others, ERP vendors like Sage and Xero, and they're all trying to help bring AI to you. But I think it's just interesting to note that, you know, it's such an interesting amount of you know, other departments or areas that come before where our CPAs typically and traditionally spend their time, which is in that strategy and corporate finance and risk areas. So just an interesting note, because I think when we talk about artificial intelligence, when we talk about other, you know, deeper technologies, I sometimes find that our internal to the enterprise are you know, sort of as behind when it comes to strategic and corporate finance. And I mean, you spent time with these types of clients in your prior life, Stuart. So what are your thoughts on on something like this? And would you agree, I guess, that it's a bit of a shame that we're not spending more time as industry professionals trying to help those groups?
Well, I think if you look at the use cases for artificial intelligence in marketing and sales, there tends to be quite an easy variable to optimize on. It's the number of marketing qualified leads, or the number of clicks, or the number of sales. I think when you start to come into the world of strategy and corporate finance, some of those variables become much more difficult to pin down. They become more fluid, more judgmental. So the use cases for artificial intelligence becomes more exploratory than perhaps an automation use case. So it's a question of understanding what our client base looks like, understanding what options we might have as a company, looking for opportunities for process improvement that is, focused on that people section of the people, technology, and process trifecta. So I think we are seeing these use cases starting to grow, and this McKinsey study backs it up, that strategy and corporate finance is seeing significant gains, both in terms of average revenue increase, but also in terms of average cost decrease. So it does seem like firms are waking up to the potential for using artificial intelligence to help improve their decision making.
Yeah, and I think it's really exciting kind of where we are. So what I'd like to do is transition the conversation a little bit to something that we sort of articulated in the initial the brief, which is to really talking about standards and how we get there, in terms of trying to help these CPAs that are probably tuning in on what they could be thinking about, how they could be thinking about disruption. And I think it's important to look at, again, both sides of the coin. So we'll start with a more traditional perspective of audit, those that are in industry, at big or small firms. And I think all of you would probably agree that it's all around measuring that risk, deciding how you're going to attack, looking at that client's financials and coming up with your statement on whether you feel that they're free of material misstatement. And so, this is just obviously a very simple perspective of in practice what we see happening. Most of you probably have a calculation like this for risk of material misstatement. And what I'd like to sort of argue is I think the standards are already talking about advanced techniques. I wouldn't say that they're calling out artificial intelligence, but I think that they're really talking about some ways that you could be leveraging data and content to really take a refined view of this type of risk. And so I just thought I would bring a few to the forefront. Obviously, AU-C 315, which is upcoming, is based on the international standard for audit 315. And we highlighted a couple of things here, which I think are really kind of interesting. And, Stuart and I kind of went through this, and then, I'll come back to you, Stuart, in just a few seconds. But, we really do think that thinking about technology as a gateway to help you look for things is probably the single biggest way that you can get there. It's why we've got that, that crosshair symbol on the screen, right? Because really part of what you're trying to do in finding that overall risk when you're making that overall assertion is to understand where the data is. And so in 315, when it talks about assessing the risk of material misstatement, it does talk about the upper end of the spectrum. And so when I think of that, when I think of how technology can help is, if you're looking at just a small sample of data, a small sample of transactions or entries, you're really missing the opportunity to have something look at the whole population of data and then identify and focus for you those that are in the quote unquote or the highlighted area, right, the upper end of the spectrum, right? And that's how I interpret that. And I know obviously as a non-CPA, as a non-chartered accountant, Stuart, you might have slight deviations in my mindset, but I think that sometimes we look at high monetary value and we look at setting the materiality in such a way that it actually it takes away from maybe the intent of this, which is to find those kind of outlier areas, right? Those strange or odd perspectives. I'd equally say, when you're planning the audit up front, you're also looking, in that planning to look for ways to test the populations. And again, I think that this comes back to your point, Stuart, about data. Data, I think, is going to be a really critical element in people's future in terms of even just doing this step, because we're having different client conversations. We're obviously in a currently still under the global pandemic. We've got challenges in how we perform the audits. So getting more data and testing it differently is probably a good thing. Stuart, how would you think of this? In terms of both 300 and 315 in terms of the standards. Do you see it the same way? Would you add anything to the color that I'm providing?
Well, I was having a bit of a laugh at your inclusion of these slides, and we'll make a CPA of you yet, to be honest, John. But I think when I look at how the audit industry as a whole approaches planning, and so, for instance, starting actually with the Bryden review, which was a review into the state of the UK market, which was kind of commissioned after large public outcry into the quality of audit in the UK. One of the key things that Bryden talks about is the fact that many assessments of risk, and I'm paraphrasing here, but generally speaking, many assessments of risk and many sample sizes are more based in the auditor's judgment and than on any kind of real evidence. And for me, what this is saying, what Bryden is basically saying here, is that it comes down to the gut feeling of the auditor rather than on some robust forensic or investigative approach that was taken at the planning stage of the audit. And I strongly suspect that what we're going to see over the next few years is a bit of a transition, both from enabled by technologies such as Mindbridge, but also by a variety of other new approaches that are coming to market that will allow auditors to get a much better understanding of what's happening within their clients' books. And I think that there should be a strong incentive to do this today. We often have conversations about whether this is necessary or whether it's on top of the checklist. And ultimately, finding that hand grenade in your client's data with enough maneuvering room, with enough foresight, is likely to improve your firm's profitability overall.
Yeah, and I think that as I think about the challenge of everyone's probably thinking to themselves, how do I incorporate technology, and is this increasing risk? I think it's interesting to also point out, right, that there isn't an expectation that there will be no risk in anything that you review, right? There's no such thing as absolute assurance. And I think that, when I then recur that, sort of think that and digest that back into technology and how it may help, I start thinking about where we can implement into various procedures in order to reduce the time in that particular procedure. But really all you're doing is you're really shifting. It's kind of like a ledger anyways, right? You're just shifting from one side of the ledger to the other. If you reduce time over here in, say, 10 procedures, doing, revenue testing, you can get a much better picture of the revenue, or look at your current commitments in terms of payables and find out which vendors you're working with are exorbitantly high or off the charts in terms of outliers, and really identify those. So if you could have a system that's digging through the data, which naturally, when pulled into your methodology, reduces the overall time, you're really just pushing that time to a different piece of the ledger, which I think is the important part, is that, how can you then take those elements of information and really draw more sort of aware judgment calls on whether something's been missed, right? Or whether something could lead to a misstatement. And I just think that, sometimes we have this conversation. We're going to talk about this a little bit later as well, Stuart, I think, around just change in general. But, would you believe that also to be sort of a key piece of this puzzle, which is, it's not really about necessarily reducing the time or the cost of an audit, right? It's really about changing where the auditor's doing the work and what type of work they can then therefore do, which maybe they've been struggling to do. Am I making sense?
Yeah, you are. I like to talk a lot about audit effectiveness, and some of this comes back to the wider debate that's going on about the role that auditors play and the expectations that the wider public will and should have on how effective auditors should be. My personal opinion is that there is an opportunity in using these kind of technologies to drastically improve the effectiveness of the audit process as a whole. And there should be, when you think about it, a link between the effectiveness of the audit process and the valuation of the business that they're looking at. I mean, credibility in financials is a huge underpinning of that business value, of that enterprise value. And I strongly believe that we can get to a position where auditors are focusing on those kind of 4 invoices that are risky rather than the 40 that are totally fine, and should be using some other method to derive evidence on the rest of those 40, rather than
Right.
individually checking those dates through, you know?
And it kind of goes to the next point, which is, okay, let's follow the bouncing ball that I'm trying to create here, which maybe it's not going to be as clear for everyone as it is in my mind. So bear with me. But we talked early on about 300 and 315 being the planning side, and then the actual risk assessment side. There's another big piece of this, which I think is still morphing and changing, which is also talking about evidence. And obviously, one of the things that a lot of members here on the webinar are going to be thinking about is, I've got to make sure that I can pass my peer reviews. I got to make sure if I'm doing let's say a public company audit that's under the guidance of PCAOB regulation, which therefore means I've got an inspection at some point. The question always comes down to, well, how do I, if I'm moving that ledger, right? If I'm picking those 40 really important ones, what do I do with it? And how do I make sure that I can provide the sufficient and appropriate audit evidence? What are your thoughts on that, and how do you think technology is going to change what this means, let's say over the next 3 to 5 years, and what could they be doing today?
Well, I think auditors have been selling themselves short for a long time, to be honest. I think a lot of the classic ways that people have approached these problems are quite analytical in nature. And I think we'll see a bit of a scaling and a formalization of those kind of approaches. So I think about, for instance, reconciliations between various systems. And, you say reconciliations, and almost every auditor will have an example in their mind of doing a reconciliation between 2 systems. Ultimately, that is a large-scale data-driven approach that is drawing some kind of assurance about the way the information is flowing through the system. And I strongly suspect that those kind of techniques, married with machine learning matching, machine learning anomaly detection, that is presented in a way that is relevant and robust for auditors, will start to take over a lot of the evidence creation in the fieldwork stage of the audit, at least for kind of day-to-day routine transactions. And I strongly suspect that this will happen over the next few years.
And you'll note here as I move to this other slide, which is talking about original documents. And I was having a funny conversation with you the other day with another former auditor who's kind of moved into more of a methodology sort of role within an alliance. And what's interesting is we talked about the photocopies, which I've appropriately highlighted here. And we were talking about copying over the 18 column ledger paper, and using the Xerox, having folks stand at the Xerox early on in their careers, which of course you missed some of, just based on the fact that we have gone more digital. But I wonder if this is a continued issue that we will see resolved, which is getting all of the data that we want and obtaining that data from clients is actually quite hard. And I wonder, is there a piece of this that we have to think about, which is communicating? So now I'm going to be talking to the other side of the membership here who might be working in industry. Do we need to educate the industry on why it's so important to start moving towards digital platforms for all things finance? What do you think about that?
Well, I found it quite interesting, just dwelling on the auditor enterprise relationship. I had a client of ours in the UK who is going to tender for a significant sized audit. And one of the questions that this audit prospect asked was, can we just pump data straight into Mindbridge? What I'd like to do is just eliminate all of this data extraction and import and just pump it straight in. And therefore you're much more up to speed with what's going on, and you're much better informed, and we're not taking you through the basic questions every time that we speak. So I found that quite interesting, because it was one of the first times that conversation was being driven by the finance team within an enterprise, rather than driven by the audit firms here in the UK. And there's been a bit of a push in a lot of UK firms to connect up to clients' bookkeeping systems in various ways. Anyway,
Right.
but I did think that was quite informative or illustrative of where we are here in London. But I think when you look at the standard overall, the fundamentals still apply. It's still about, on balance, is the evidence that we're getting sufficient to draw a conclusion from, or draw the conclusion that we need to draw from it? I think the piece that is perhaps going to increase quite significantly, particularly with the rise of data APIs, is the use of multiple different data sources in order to validate the same thing. So perhaps the role of the traditional invoice might be lessened because it's easier to manipulate a digital invoice than it used to be with paper invoices. But perhaps there are other ways to validate that information. It's easier to hook up to the supplier's API to figure out what they're, to do the confirmation, or easier to check the purchase price via some kind of online API that displays all of those prices. So I think fundamentally we won't see a massive shift here, but what we will see is a much broader spectrum of information being used.
Gotcha. So, obviously, how do you make sure that you're compliant with whatever standard you're obviously bound to? Here in for this audience, obviously it's with what AICPA has defined in the AUCs. I think really when I look at it, it's around exactly what you were just talking about. Is can you bring together enough of the right information to sort of ensure that you've spent the time needed to review and see if there's any potential areas that are higher risks of material misstatement. And what you're sort of saying, I think, is yes, the digital world creates a new level of potential challenge. You're right. Digital invoices, purchase orders, even things like emails. So I mean, we've all seen the sort of the ways that people are maybe being less than authentic in the way that they're using digital technologies and maybe making changes. But your point is, what if we could bring together multiple bits of information and have it actually do some of that automatic footing and tying, and making sure that with that we then can bring the right level of awareness to the ones that maybe aren't as consistent across all the data that's available. So
absolutely nailed it.
I think it comes down to then this new piece where I think a lot of people are coming, and you've spent a lot of time with a variety of different sort of methodology teams, here in North America, but also in the UK, which is where you're based. But I'm just showing something that we created in Mindbridge, and rather than dive into the tool, we'll just kind of have a quick look at it on the screen here. But what I think I would say is we're trying to move more towards scoring all of the data down at the entry level, rolling it all the way back up through the various elements of the financial statement. So you can see the various account groupings here that you would expect to see. And what I've just done is I've blown that out so that you can actually see, sort of risk or scores across the different assertion areas. When you think about what we're doing, and when you think about everything that we've just talked about, how do you join those two pieces together? People changing methodology, trying to rely on, an AI system that's looked at every single entry. How would you use this type of screen, or this type of bit of information that's contained within the Mindbridge platform to really help with that, spectrum of the audit, right from early sort of risk assessment and planning through to, obviously completion of finding the right evidence to back up the opinion?
Well, it feels like we are, as an industry, the pace of change is accelerating as it relates to some of these questions. What is audit evidence, and what is sufficient, and what's reliable, and so on. So it's probably a good time to be an audit methodology provider. But I think it's a question of coming to grips as a firm with the underlying risk scoring methodology. And when we set out to build this presentation of risk, we really had it in our minds that people would be able to go to Mindbridge and ask questions like, show me the cutoff risk within my purchase invoices, and have a robust way to both discover what is high risk within that particular subset of data, as well as a way to justify what is low risk.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, continue on.
Well, when it comes to change, I think it's a question of building a core group of individuals who are comfortable with the techniques, comfortable with the strengths and the weaknesses of the techniques, and able to sufficiently test this kind of methodology on enough clients to build a broader set of consensus around, right? It's about, as a firm, coming up with a methodology or adhering to a methodology that is comfortable with these kind of data-driven approaches.
And I think that you mentioned change, and I think that, you know, this is all what we started the top of this conversation, right? Is be disruptive and be transformative. And I think that as we think about the professionals of the future, it really aligns to the next bit of the conversation, which is, okay, hey, I'm in an enterprise, right? I'm a chartered accountant, I'm a qualified accountant, I'm a CPA. I'm in, you know, these enterprises trying to work at whatever my job might be. And I mean, obviously accountants can take any type of job outside of just, you know, finance and accounting jobs. Although that is typically where you've sort of normally centered when you leave. You either, you know, obviously to get your designation, you spend time in audit and tax, and then you move into something, right? And so those of you that have moved into enterprise, I think one of the things I wanted to highlight was the Future of Jobs report. And I don't know if everyone has seen the most recent one, which just came out a little bit ago, which is, you know, what are the roles that are increasing in demand and decreasing in demand? And I kind of put this title here because I thought it really is important. And I think about one of the reasons why I selected Stuart to come and spend some time with you and talk with me more specifically, because it's a little bit one way in this webinar. But, you know, your roles, your abilities are actually already in excessive demand. Oh, sorry about that. In excessive demand. And it's like 5 out of the top 7 increasing demand jobs, and 10 of the top 20, in my opinion, all directly relate to skills you likely have, or that aren't that far of a leap for you to get there. You know, data analysts and data scientists, AI and machine learning specialists, big data specialists, business development professionals, digital transformation specialists. And I'm just calling out the ones that I'm thinking of right off the top of my head. You know, strategic advisors. Most of you are already strategic advisors inside your firm. You know, management and organizational analysts. I mean, risk. I mean, you just keep going through the list. I could probably pick out a few more. But when I think about what's increasing in demand, and I think about then on the converse, what's been decreasing, I really don't see a huge amount of delta in terms of the person. I see it in terms of the skill, right? So, you know, obviously, you know, not to really put doom and gloom on this, but obviously data entry clerks, accounting, bookkeeping, payroll, and accountants and auditors are 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the decreasing demand. But when you think about the skills that you have, and I think the skills that the professionals of today are coming out of school with, and in your firms as you're grooming them, I think you're learning a lot of this anyways. And I kind of mentioned Stuart's accomplishments very vaguely in terms of data science, but I mean, we've leveraged Stuart here internally on a series of data science work, and his prior role, he did a lot of data science. So maybe, Stuart, when you think about these sort of job roles, these types of capabilities, what do you think the potential barriers are, and what do you think the existing skills are for our audience to think about, you know, when it relates to technology and what's important to them?
Well, I think there's been a lot of fear-mongering, actually, when it comes to specifically accountants and auditors and the role, the impact that AI will have on them. A lot of this comes back to, I think it was a University of Oxford study reprinted by The Economist that ranked, you know, auditors and accountants as some of the most likely to be automated. But ultimately, if you've got an audit background, and many of you in enterprise do, you're used to thinking in a particularly statistical way. I mean, audit is by nature a process that draws conclusions from a limited sample of tests about a population of data. And thinking about how to construct audit tests involve not just a sound understanding of business processes and how information flows through businesses, which is a vital skill to be a data analyst and a data scientist in business at least, but it also includes understanding what is a sufficient amount of work in order to draw a conclusion about that business as a whole, which again is a crucial piece of being a strong data analyst. So it comes back to what I was saying earlier. I think many auditors have been selling themselves short. And I also think that not all accountants do the same work. I think that there's a real variety of different types of work within the sector. There's a real variety of skill sets and knowledge bases. So I absolutely think some of those are going to be susceptible to automation. But it's interesting because when you look at this, it's got accountants and auditors on that decreasing demand, but yet so many firms are doing well. So and seeing consistent revenue increases. So I'm not entirely sure that I wholly believe that.
Well, I think it's also important to note, not just at the firm level, but a lot of the industry right now with where we've had challenges, and yes, there's been some failures as a result of the economy. But I think um, we could argue that firms are actually increasing their spend in this area, in finance and accounting, and bringing CPA skills in. And I share that because my next slide here is about what the IAA has been doing, and of course their framework for defense in terms of internal audit, in the three layers of roles, first line support, second line support, and third line support. They've made some important changes, and I think that it's really interesting that the incoming global chair is really talking about the ever evolving risk landscape. And so what's going to be interesting is, I think there's a huge opportunity, and I'm fairly positive that those that have listened to myself before, and obviously those that have listened to folks like Tom Hood and Dan Burris, maybe at the onset of this CPA Innovation Summit, some of those early webinars, you'd know that the ever-changing bit, the ever-evolving bit, and the risk bit means that as accountants, you actually have a huge amount of skill that a lot of teams don't, right? You just think about going concern for a second, right? How many enterprises today are asking themselves, 2020 was a challenging year. What is 2021, 22, 23 going to look like? How many of them have a CPA at the helm within their core finance, within their core operations, right? A lot. And so I think that what I actually believe with this change in the framework, you're also going to see an uptick in just different application of skills. So I'm kind of agreeing with you wholeheartedly here, Stuart, that I don't think that the downturn is that I think the name of the role is going to change, and what you're doing in the role is changing, but I think you're going to be using those skills to bolster businesses in a different way. I mean, that would be my perspective of it. And I look at the industry as a whole and say, why is that? And it's really, very, very simple, right? We talk about zettabytes of data, and everyone goes, okay, that's a lot of zeros, but they really don't have a concept of what a zettabyte is. And when we talk about 12 zettabytes of financial data, the way to think about that would be that if every byte of data was a bottle of water, if you could conceptualize, a 500 milliliter bottle of water that you get at the store, 8 ounces, for those of us that are thinking in that term, it would take one zettabyte would take all the water in all the lakes, rivers, streams, oceans in the world to fill a bottle that size. Now we're talking about 12 of those, so 12 of the world's water supply, of financial data. And if you thought like having to swim through all of that is probably pretty hard, right? And so when we talk about 5% of that, or sorry, 0.5% of that, excuse me, of that data is being used in analytics, in the business, in the things that maybe you guys are working on, that's where it kind of drives me like, okay, there has to be change. And I think the champions of change need to be the people who are skilled at analysts, right? Which is a little bit, I think, if I'm not mishearing you, Stuart, that's what you're sort of agreeing with.
Yeah, more or less, yeah.
And I think that, I think it's this other piece of the problem pie. And I'm not usually a huge fan of pie charts, but it was the only way I could think of representing the 80-20 rule on this one. But it's how do we move and invert this and take 80% of the time around manually gathering, verifying, consolidating data, whatever that data might be. Obviously, as I said, more often than not, we see lots of accountants, obviously, within the Office of Finance. So that's one area, but just even in performance management across a business, right? HR, operations, if you're a manufacturer, all of your supply chain analytics, all of that is stuff that I think accountants are well suited to. But we need to flip the argument of, or the time frame of spending time digging through data. Again, imagine 12 worlds worth of water, trying to sift through that. I mean, obviously not every business has 12 worlds worth of water, but you get the idea, right? It's just a vast quantity. And we need to kind of flip it on its head. And so, when we think about the current methods of how, internal auditors, other analysts are working, it's typically running a series of known things, right? Whether those are rules that you're sort of used to, whether it's gut feel. I mean, I think of a lot of business analytics tools, and especially ones that are more visual analytics tools, which is all about data presentation. The thing I worry about without better technology is the amount of bias that can go into there, and the fact that you're only going to be looking at data that you're thinking you want to pull together. I think what we see when we start talking to clients about why they would implement something like, Mindbridge's platform, it's because of the depth that we go to and the amount of coverage we maintain. And while we do that, we also bring it back to something that's meaningful and useful. So, Stuart, just some thoughts on why this is so important to an enterprise to think of as well. It's not just about the risk, although that's really important. I mean, obviously, in the 3 lines of defense, part of that is to actually get a sense of, is there a risk to my business? And obviously, looking at the core financials, looking at the core areas of the subledgers is obviously paramount in reducing the overall risk. But just thinking about the data and thinking about using AI, I thought this chart would be at least representative of the types of things that an AI-based system could do. But what are your thoughts on that? What are your thoughts on moving the needle, getting our listeners to leverage more data, use it in effective ways, and not being afraid of starting to go down this path of using AI to sort of break down some of those biases in other business analytics tools? Thoughts, comments?
Well, I think ultimately using a tool like Mindbridge, it allows for a holistic view of the business, which is useful, if you've got multiple different systems or perhaps things don't consolidate in a way that's nice. But ultimately, all of this comes down to having that extra data point, having, if you're looking for somebody in woods, having that extra spotlight that looks from a different direction that might catch something you've missed. And that might not necessarily be risk. It might also be a different way to think about your business, or a different narrative which is crucial to the business as a whole. And this could be from, as simple as why have sales gone up or down, all the way down to a very high level strategic decisions about where the future of the business should go. And I think one of the key challenges in doing a lot of that analysis is the manual work that's required to get to that point. So I think having different tool sets for different purposes is vital. I'm a big believer of best in breed, have the right tool for the problem you're trying to solve. I think that there's a role for real-time reporting, there's a role for data exploration tools, there's a role for transformation tools. All of them the context of your business needs to be taken into consideration. And I think what I found quite interesting over the last few months is talking to financial controllers and CFOs from businesses that really span the complexity scale, and really, talking businesses of similar sizes, where on one hand, a largely acquisitive business has got a large number of ERPs and need some way to view a single consistent perspective across their entire organization, whereas an organization that's got everything well planned from day dot, everything on a single ERP, is looking at a different set of use cases and a different value proposition, but both of them focus on a greater level of understanding and a different perspective of the data, and using that to drive decisions.
Like it. Now, I'm gonna kind of transition the rest of the conversation to be really a conversation on change, and really a discussion on the things that I think are really important. And I think that You know, when I go back to what I originally wanted to have as an outcome for this was to help the audience understand that, you know, technology is there. We've always been using different technologies for different things, so it's not like it's not a new normal, right? And I think that one of the things that's just a little bit scarier about advanced technologies, you know, robotics process automation, or RPA as some would call it, you know, the bots, you know, other AI-based systems, concepts like Mindbridge, even things like blockchain, is that it's the personal problem where we get into this issue around change. And I'm going to steal a slide that Tom Hood actually presented, I believe it was 2 summits ago, with myself, and it was all around, you know, looking at change and instead of it being, you know, change doing things differently, but let's transform and let's do different things. And I think that's a little bit of what Stuart and I are trying to get to in this conversation, right? Is technology is an enabler in more ways than one. You've always been changing, whether it's adapting to new standards and regulations for our IFRS standards, or you know, for those of you in the audit profession itself, or in the tax profession, various standards and regulations that are coming down. But it's really about transforming our businesses, and that is all shapes and sizes. So I really want to take the last, you know, sort of 5-10 minutes really talking about that as a challenge, right? Talking about what change needs to look like. And what's interesting is, you know, we're big fans of using data, and this is something from the Boston Consulting Group, from a little while ago, probably 2018's reports from them. And it's really interesting because it obviously focuses on what Mindbridge does, which is talking about AI, but it really talks about the fact that this isn't just a technological challenge, right? It's an actual adaptive and adoptive problem. And this is their breakdown, right? 10% of what you're going to get out of implementing artificial intelligence is actually the algorithms themselves. So, you know, I'd love to say we're everything and anything to everyone in terms of what we do, but really, when you think about the bigger change, it's about the other 90%, and that's the you know, other technology barriers and hopefully changes, and then the people and process piece. Because really, what you need to be able to do is you need to be able to take that 70%, the people and process, and really start dissecting it and really start working through how technology is going to actually function in the future and help you get to those future outcomes, right? The technology bits are all about the enablement side of it and making sure that it actually works. And you know, one of the things we hear quite often, you know, with clients that are looking at our tech, have used our tech, is, you know, data needs to be more accessible, and we wholeheartedly agree, right? We have a series of direct connectors in our most recent edition that have all come out, but really, when I look at the, you know, where we are, what we have, you know, I think that the technology and where clients are going to need to go is actually opening up even further and providing more access to the data that's there, to the information, and use technology as a gateway to getting to things done. Like I said, algorithms are kind of the smallest piece of this, but in terms of the value they bring, once you've done the people and process, and once you've set the infrastructure ready so that you can accept the data, then it can become a huge amount of value, right? So I would actually invert this in terms of where the value is long term, right? The value long term will be in algorithms and models that help you grow your business, once you get over this first hump of the people and process thing. So what am I talking about there? Well, the concepts around, you know, how you actually change is that the adaptive changes, right? The people and process bits of it, more or less, are about the thinking and feeling. You know, like how do you change those mental mindsets and transform things? And the technical is really just what you're using. You know, there's organizations, I'm sure, that have gone through this issue of moving from one system to another. Maybe as you've moved your organizations from one to another, you're really starting to think about, you know, just using different tools. In my case, as a great example, you know, I came from an environment that used the Microsoft Office suite for everything we did, including Outlook. This is going back a few years. I'll say that it was 10. Then I went into an organization that had their own proprietary email system. They were a very big blue chip company that had bought some technology 10 or 15 years before I got there, and that was our email system. Some people will know it and remember it, and potentially lovingly like it, love it as it was Lotus Notes and the whole collaboration tools that IBM had. And then I came to Mindbridge and I had to learn something new again, and we used Google as our platform for everything. And so what's interesting is when you look at that, that challenge, you have to start thinking about it in terms of those thinking elements, right? The adaptive changes through to the other side of, how do I actually physically get people ready to go? So let's talk about the adaptive change just for a second. AI, has historically been called a black box. People have been trying to talk about things like a white box. I don't think there's actually a black and a white to this conversation. What I think there is that people worry that they don't understand how the algorithms found the things they found or did the things they did. In the case of autonomous vehicles, people are obviously very concerned about the decisions an autonomous vehicle would make when there may have to be an incident. But equally, the same thing could be said about our data and about our how we look at financial data, right? We want to make sure we understand it. We want to make sure how it benefits me. We want to make sure that we understand how my clients, if I'm an auditor working with clients or an advisor working with clients, and inside my business, I want to know how it impacts the rest of my business, right? I'm thinking of these things, I'm feeling of these things, and I'm trying to understand the way that the system or the mechanism is going to do that. And so to do that, you need sort of a little bit more transparency. So one of the calls to action, if you want to understand more about our transparency, is actually come and see some of our other webinars on the mindbridge.ai site. You'll see some around explaining AI. You'll see some around, transforming from that black box. And I think it's really important that you start embracing and taking the time to understand it, right? And time is a really big thing, right? That first bullet point in blue, having the time and the space. On the same side, we've got to be ready for this technical change, right? We need to make sure that we can help guide our teams, whoever they may be, from point A to point B. And in one of the things that we really think about in this spectrum is that the tool is only as good as how it gets implemented and understood, right? And so you're taking that thinking and feeling side, and you're actually trying to design a pathway technically of how you're going to get there. So when Stuart and I were looking at a couple of quick screenshots, we looked at a predictive algorithm that allows me to look over time where that data is and how those data, how the data might map, to a potential predictive forecast. You want to be able to understand what it did and what it looked like, and then how you would then use that in execution to a client deliverable or an organizational deliverable. Equally, you want to know what an outlier is. You want to know what a rare flow might be of data. And so being able to dig into the data within the tool, being able to self-explore is really important, but you need to look through also how you're going to train, your whole teams on it. Thankfully, with email, that's a pretty easy thing. Most of them are all the same now. They might look different. They might have slightly different buttons, but at the end of the day, it's compose something new. At the end of you composing something new, it's hit the send button. AI is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be different because it's going to change, as Stuart was talking a little bit about the methodology, right? It was going to change where you go. And I think that really when you want to go from today's standing start, maybe this is the first time you've heard from me and the Mindbridge team, maybe this is the 20th time, I'm not sure, but really it's to start driving through this adoption pyramid yourselves, right? So right now, how do you become an advocate, right? Well, you become aware, you start getting a clear understanding of what's there. Hopefully you get to the point where you want to work with us or other firms, right? There's other great firms that are part of the sponsors of the CPA Innovation Summit. Some of my favorites obviously are Intuit and the QuickBooks team, Sage, XCM, which I believe was just had a bit of a transition or is in the middle of a transition, BotKeeper. Like there's a really great ecosystem of technology, but to really start getting there, it's understand that potential value that it's going to bring to you, right? And really be able to actually speak it out yourself, not just the words that I am saying or that Stuart said, right? And then we can go through the rest of the steps to that overall advocacy of using technology appropriately inside your business. And I think that when we do this, when we can clearly communicate in our own language and have that understanding, you're going to be poised for an amazing amount of success to your business problem, or what it might be. And I'll leave with one sort of quote as I start to ramp down, and it's really about, okay, what is the impact of artificial intelligence on accountancy, on audit, on corporate finance? And Richard Anning, who I've spent some time with in my past, put this message out in one of his reports. He's the head of tech faculty over at the ICAW, so the Institute of Chartered Accountants of England and Wales, and a really great team that is designed around helping educate, the masses of new chartered accountants that are coming through. And his statement, and I'll just read it because I think it's kind of important and impactful, right? First, accountants will need to understand at a basic level how AI works. Little pause from his actual quote, right? How it works. What is it trying to do? Understand that it's not a black box. Understand the things that it's looking at. Understand why it needs that much data, right? Continuing the quote, and how to work with AI specialists. This might be team members from Mindbridge. This might be team members from another firm that you're working with. This might be people in your own business, right, who have computer engineering and data science degrees, right? Because that match of the technology and the people, right, is really important. Continue on with the quote, right? They will need more technology knowledge and skills than perhaps has been needed in the past to be intelligent and responsible users of the tech. And I think that end part of the quote is also one of the things that I'm really glad that Richard talked about, because one of the things that's really important around making this move, taking up the time and going up that adoption ladder, is the fact that we don't know all the things that people are going to need in the future. We never have. We've all been great stewards of the profession. You do your CPE every year. Hopefully you do more than you need to do, because it's not just a tech checkbox, but it's how do you start becoming aware? How do you start acquiring the right skills and talents within your teams, within your groups, within your firms, right? Because it is going to change. And I think that the good news is the tech is also changing. Very much like I use the example of, my very first BlackBerry. It was pretty simple to use, but it wasn't the easiest thing to use. And then I got the one with the keyboard, and it was a little bit easier to communicate. Well, now I have Diction on my smartphone, right? And this is what will happen for us in accounting and finance roles, right? This will happen to the profession. We will become more and more adept at using the tech. We will become more and more comfortable at using the tech. But I always want to go back to even why we brought up the standards in this webinar for you, is because your judgment, right, as a professional, is really paramount. And how you interpret that data, how you interpret the results of something, right, is what Richard's kind of getting to at the bottom part of this quote, right? To be intelligent and responsible users of the tech, right? Just using a piece of technology and saying that the job's done probably isn't going to pass a peer review, probably isn't going to pass a PCAOB inspection. You need to start digging in. And I think that's where the first part of his quote is really important. Understanding the tech, working with AI specialists, and coming to that common foundation so that your knowledge can be increased. So I think, I've probably kind of run almost a full bit of time here for you. I just want to part with a couple of words of thank you. Thank you first and foremost to Stuart for spending a bit of time with me, as crazy as I am, in going through these types of things. Thank you to the audience. I mean, this is time out of your day to listen to what we're thinking about in terms of trying to be disruptive, trying to help you disrupt yourselves. And really a big thanks to the Maryland Association of CPAs and the team that's putting together the CPA Innovation Summit. Kudos to you as a team. Great event. We were really happy to participate. And if you need anything else from the Mindbridge team, obviously the links are all there, in the World Wide Web. Come and see us, spend some more time with us. But I really want to take time to really thank you, thank the team that supported me today, thank the team over at MACPA and the Business Learning Institute. I think these are great events, and I hope that you got a little bit of value out of it and can forge ahead with a little bit more knowledge that will help you in your journey to leverage these advanced technologies. So thanks a lot, and have a great afternoon, morning, or evening, whenever you're listening to the webinar.